Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. Well, last night, Kamala Harris formally accepted the nomination to be the Democratic candidate for president. Emily Jashinsky, our very own DC correspondent, was there. She was in the hall. She's been there all week. She is, of course, host of Undercurrents, our new show that is coming out of the DC Bureau twice a week. So make sure to go over to the Undercurrents channel and check that out and subscribe there to get that show. It's really coming on nicely. Emily, thanks for getting up bright and early for us today. At the risk of getting completely destroyed in the comments, I actually thought it was pretty good. Maybe my priors here need updating, but weirdly, for people watching afar, Kamala Harris has never really been thought of as a serious person. Even though she's been vice president for 4 years, oddly, with all those internet memes and the sense that she was a sort of ultra progressive and was kind of slightly tokenistic, and then, you know, she can speak. She held her lines, and actually I thought she gave quite a good impression. I think a lot of people who haven't really thought about her very much might come away from that thinking, she's actually a serious person.
Yeah, probably. It was pretty standard, and it was risk averse, I would say. You know, there weren't a ton of huge, meaty policy initiatives or anything announced in the speech, which is, again, it's fairly standard. But it was well delivered. She did a good job. She was speaking in ways that didn't, you know, she's on the teleprompter. Most of those low light reels of Kamala Harris that have gone viral of her talking about Venn diagrams and school buses and space and all of that have been her off of a teleprompter, which is why you're not seeing her do a lot of interviews actually right now, because they're trying at all costs to avoid a moment like that when they're sort of on cloud nine. Why, you know, if it's not broke, don't fix it. And right now it's not broke. So I agree. I think, you know, the DNC did a good job, and Kamala Harris did a good job reintroducing herself to the American people. There were no major blunders whatsoever. The vibes were high. The only thing that I walked away thinking was she was getting yes, she can chants, obviously very Obama-esque. That happened last night. It happened during Barack Obama's speech. Time magazine put her on the cover with that illustration of her looking Obama-esque. There have been a lot of Obama comparisons. And if you saw that speech after seeing all of the hype, you might think, I was expecting Obama and I got, you know, pretty standard politician. That would be the only thing I would say.
Let's talk about what she did not say, because you've written a great piece for us this morning at UnHerd saying there was no mention of her being a woman. Contrast this to Hillary Clinton's speech just a couple of nights earlier and the old rhetoric about glass ceilings and young girls growing up believing they can achieve highest office. And that was all present, as you would expect in Hillary's speech. Not a single mention in Kamala's.
Not once. Not once. And the most significant statement in the arena last night about Kamala Harris perhaps being the first female president of the United States of America in a matter of weeks was a sartorial one. It was a silent statement. Women came to the arena wearing suffragette white, and it was a lot. I mean, it was speakers, members of Congress. They really dotted the arena, but Kamala Harris didn't say a word about it. Most of her surrogates throughout the week didn't say a word about it, beyond Hillary Clinton, who on that first night made a very sort of Clinton-esque speech. It sounded like the way she talked about this issue a lot in 2016, but they haven't really made an issue of it. And I wonder if that's because they have realized a lot of voters are fine with a woman president. This shows up in polling, fine with a woman president, but they don't want to, it's not like an extremely important issue to them. It's not a very important issue to them, to borrow phrases from the polling itself. And I imagine for a lot of people, it feels like almost you're being emotionally blackmailed when you're being told that, you know, this is history and you have to be a part of it.
She didn't mention race either, I would say. I mean, she talked about wanting to be a president no matter what your color, which was more sort of, again, Obama-esque rhetoric. There wasn't a lot of talk about the fact that she was not white either. It almost feels like an orchestrated campaign to try to reposition her as less of a kind of identity-focused progressive and more of a centrist Democrat. Do you think that's true?
Absolutely. It's absolutely true. And she mentioned last night that her mom was a brown woman. That was kind of the extent of it. Her stepdaughter, Ella Emhoff, talked about how Kamala Harris is committed to social justice from the stage. And, there were mentions of her race and her sex throughout the week, but it was not a focus at all, like you might have expected it to be just a couple of years ago, given the rhetoric that people were seeing from high-profile Democrats, especially if you think back to the year 2020. The focus is absolutely elsewhere, and it's noteworthy. I think my take on it is that Democrats want to win this election. I don't think anyone's beliefs have shifted necessarily. I think they just realize that it's not super appealing to the American public right now, at least the climate in the country. People really want to hear about more about immigration, the economy, and kitchen table issues. And Kamala Harris herself has what she calls her 3 a.m. policy. And I remember covering her original Senate campaign. She was more interesting than a lot of people gave her credit for, because she went to a fundraiser in Hollywood and was telling people that the identity politics stuff doesn't work for Democrats, because when they're awake at 3 a.m., they're not worrying about identity politics. They're worrying about kitchen table issues. So she's had that in her for a while, and it's out in full force now.
Yeah, and that surprised me. Also, no mention of equity. No mention of fixing boardroom representation or a minority representation. None of that at all, even in the more sort of policy-focused bits. I would say, rhetorically, it was still very much a progressive speech. I mean, the number of times she mentioned progress going forward. At one stage, she got a chant going on in the hall about, "We are not going back, we're not going back." It was very much, in that sense, a traditional progressive message. Democrats going forward, Republicans going back.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was watching the speech with some more left populists who were pretty happy with the tone that they heard from Kamala Harris. David Sirota, who was a top level figure in the Bernie Sanders campaign, said Kamala Harris is the rhetoric in her speech. That is a huge indication of the center shifting in the Democratic Party. You have to look at that as a win for progressives. Now, she might not act on it, but she is tapping into the populist economic sentiments. You know who else did that at the RNC? Was actually J.D. Vance. So it's sort of in vogue on both sides of the aisle right now.
Interesting that she manages to sound progressive without actually committing to any very progressive policies. Another thing she didn't really mention very much, Joe Biden. I mean, I think he got one, maybe two mentions. There was one right at the start, but this was very much, he was a man of the history books by the stage of this speech.
He absolutely was. They intentionally scheduled him on Monday night so he could go off to his vacation outside Santa Barbara the rest of the week and sort of become a figment of history, someone that wasn't, in the room presiding over the convention where you're in a box and the camera's cutting back to you all of the time. He really, really had faded into the background by the time Kamala Harris took the stage and mentioned him. Yeah, I think, Freddie, you're right. It was one, maybe two times in this entire, roughly 40-minute speech. He's still the sitting president of the United States, by the way. Instead, what we heard a lot of over the course of the week were things like Bill Clinton saying it felt like there was a load off everybody's shoulders, Michelle Obama saying that was a magic in the air, that hope had come back again. There were a lot of comments that I was even surprised by how brazenly kind of digs they were from the main stage.
Yeah, Joe Biden not probably tuning in and enjoying that from wherever his vacation is. A person who got mentioned rather more than I would have expected was Donald J. Trump. It's kind of a convention in big set-piece speeches like that you don't name-check your opponent 10, 20 times, because by traditional political theory, that's just giving them a boost, it's making them more famous, it's giving them attention. You might occasionally refer to my opponent. Kamala Harris completely ripped up that playbook, and she talked directly about Trump a lot. She was listing out the risks, talking about things he might do as president when he came back. I think we learned something quite significant about what her campaign is going to be like. It's an anti-Trump campaign.
Yeah, that's right. She even started talking a little bit about January 6th in her speech, which is something we had heard from others like Nancy Pelosi throughout the week. But to make it into the main event where you have, again, 30, 40 minutes to speak and you're using time on January 6th is absolutely a choice. Kamala Harris is trying to create contrast between herself and Donald Trump. They are trying to frame the election as, this is not just the positives of Kamala Harris. This is also the positives of Kamala Harris contrasted with the negatives of Donald Trump as they see them. And so it was very much a part of the story that she was telling yesterday. She went on sort of a line about how Donald Trump, unlike Donald Trump, she's not going to cozy up to tyrants and dictators because, they like him. They're rooting for him because they know he wants to be an authoritarian just like them. So you can see even when she was, kind of introducing her foreign policy to America, she was doing it as a contrast with Donald Trump. And that, I agree, Freddie, it's going to be totally central to the campaign.
I think she used the phrase that he was an unserious man, but there would be serious consequences of electing him. So we'll probably hear more of that. You mentioned foreign policy. Insofar as there was any policy in this speech, and there wasn't a lot, that got quite a chunky section of her not very long speech. And I thought the choices she made there were interesting. Let me pull out a couple of phrases. She said she wants the US to have the strongest, most lethal fighting force in the world. She wants to strengthen, not abdicate our leadership. It's maybe not exactly neocon, but this is quite strong stuff for someone considered on the left of the Democratic Party.
Yes, and I thought what was really telling is the way she approached Israel. She said, we will, to loud applause in the audience. And that was true throughout the week, where there were a chance to bring them home when parents of hostages still being held in Gaza were on the stage. Kamala Harris said, we are not abandoning Israel. She said it forcefully. She said it to huge applause. And then she immediately pivoted to offering a lot of empathy for Palestinians. That was to the extent there was an internecine controversy here this week, that was the highest profile one. There were activists and delegates in the arena. They sort of did their own protest. They staged their own protest during the convention by holding hands, linking hands, and walking around the arena as a protest of the DNC not allowing a Palestinian speaker to address the issue themselves from the stage. Heard about it a little from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a little bit from Bernie Sanders, but the DNC was going out of its way definitely to not have that issue front and center. But Kamala Harris took it head on and tried to signal both ways. Just like you were saying, Freddie, with her saying, I'm really, really tough, but also kind of anti-war, also kind of, progressive in terms of my foreign policy. She's really allowing, carefully crafting clever speeches to allow people to project onto her, which is also fairly Obama-esque, and it's intentional.
Right, so she literally says in the same sentence, it's almost become the habit now. You say, I will call on a ceasefire. I want to bring forward the ceasefire and the return of the hostages. You've got to say those two things in the same sentence to indicate something on both sides. And that kind of, both sidesism, I thought was just everywhere in that speech. And maybe she's going to get away with it. But you're none the wiser. And she sounded maybe a little bit tougher than you might have expected. But yeah, we didn't actually learn anything about her foreign policy, I didn't think.
No, and I think to the average American viewer, what she said is perfectly acceptable in a way that it really isn't to the activist left. Basically, none of the activist left that have been here protesting all week was satisfied with that. Some protests, in fact, kicked up after that speech. Someone had their car window smashed. There were more arrests made outside of Chicago, not nearly in the numbers that people were expecting. People were expecting 20,000. Some reports put it up to 100,000. I think at its highest, there was a smattering of a few thousand. I talked to a lot of them, average people, normal people, and then you had kind of hangers-on that are sort of always at events like this and do, intentionally get arrested and intentionally cause mayhem. But it was pretty typical stuff. Nobody, heard Kamala Harris's speech and said, wow, this is a brave moral stance. But again, to the average American, it probably sounded just fine. She's not taking the bait from the activist groups. And that is absolutely intentional.
Exactly, I felt the same atmosphere was when she started talking about the border and immigration. She said, I want to reform our broken immigration system. I want to secure our border. There was a lot made of that, but then she was also talking about a pathway to citizenship. So it's that same giving with one hand and taking with another. That seems to be what we're going to get here, which is a kind of carefully calibrated, hey, I'm not as woke, not as progressive left as you might have thought. I'm going to be this very careful kind of centrist Democrat.
Right. Yeah. And she's signaling to both directions. Like, she'll use rhetoric that's coded kind of centrist and rhetoric that's coded kind of progressive. And that is right out of the Obama playbook. It allows you, without getting bogged down in specifics, the specifics, let's say, of something like Project 2025, extremely specific, like a 900-page treatise specific. It allows you to sort of code this rhetoric in both directions. So without those specifics, everyone can project what they want to hear onto a candidate, when everyone, by the way, is so relieved that they don't have to vote for Joe Biden. I mean, that's a huge source of the, quote, joy here, which was very real. I've seen people who weren't here sort of dismiss it and say that's all fake, that's all media hype. It's not. People here are genuinely really excited about Kamala Harris, which is somewhat remarkable because just a month ago, Democratic loyalists, the type of people who are here, were leaking to the press that they were afraid that Kamala Harris would become the presumptive nominee if Joe Biden stepped down, because she's not, that appealing. She had really low favorability ratings that have almost turned on a dime. No, they have turned on a dime in a matter of weeks. So there's something really clever, I think, happening with the messaging here.
Okay, so we've been painting this kind of surprisingly tough-sounding, somewhat patriotic rhetoric, talking about securing the border, defending Israel, lethal fighting forces version of Kamala. There were some topics that did face the other direction, I would say, and abortion was one of them. She really spent quite a lot of time talking about that. About how the change to abortion law was squarely Donald J. Trump's fault, how he's not trusting women, and if there was any kind of gender moment where she was directly calling out to women, that it was around that topic.
Yeah, absolutely. And her favorables are actually what she's done since Biden dropped off the ticket is even expand the gender gap. There's been a decent amount of talk about this, but expand the gender gap, meaning her support among men has remained steady compared with Biden, but she's really built the Democratic Party's support with women. Just in the last several weeks, that's happened. And a big reason why, I think, is she leans into the abortion issue in a way that Joe Biden just couldn't. It is a political winner for Democrats. There's just no question about it. Donald Trump is the reason that Roe v. Wade was overturned. It's a fact. Everybody knows it. Everybody remembers when it happened. You don't have to be a wonky political nerd to remember that happening. So it feels very real to women around the country. And, that line, it's going to help with particularly, I think, suburban women in blue wall states. You think of your Wisconsins, your Michigans, your Pennsylvanias. It just works, and they know it. And that's why they leaned so hard into it last night, why Kamala Harris leaned so hard into it last night. It's been working well for them politically.
I tell you what almost feels interesting about the conversation we're having. It feels retro, because what we're doing is observing carefully chosen campaign decisions that have been calibrated to appeal to the widest possible audience, that have been turned into a speech, and that the candidate actually read out. And it feels different because most recently we've had two candidates that can barely get to the end of their teleprompter and are either going off on crazy tangents or might just keel over or sputter mid-sentence. That, to me, feels different about this. There's almost a kind of novelty of, wow, this is how we used to talk about political campaigns in the 2000s and 2010s, when you had, a competent politician who could read a script and people thinking about the best way to calibrate her message.
That's such a great point. It was utterly conventional. And I did not intend that pun, actually, but it was utterly conventional in the sort of traditional sense. But on the same... to that point, I think one of the reasons a lot of people feel, use the word again, joyful. A lot of Democrats feel that way, and Kamala Harris is improving numbers. It's, of course, that she's not Joe Biden, very unliked candidate, but B, I think it's because she feels conventional. She feels normal to a lot of people, and folks on the right will say that's, she's not normal, she's radical, and all of these different policies, et cetera, et cetera. But she feels normal. She's coded as normal, and I think that's a great point, Freddie, that the DNC was basically a very normal political production, and her speech kind of was the crescendo of that. It typified everything that people saw throughout the week.
So how does it leave us, Emily? What do you think? I mean, the polls are now showing, if anything, a slight advantage to Harris. Do you buy that? I mean, Is it just going to be a conference bounce that we now see and then we kind of get back to normal and it's straight back to 50-50? Or do you think Kamala Harris is meaningfully ahead now in this race?
Well, the Labor Day holiday is always the mile marker here in the United States where after Labor Day, campaigns really start spending in earnest. It is the final stretch, the home stretch. Everything changes after the Labor Day holiday. And the Democrats had their convention so late this year that they have about a week separating them from that, which is going to work out great in their favor because I think they're going to continue on this sugar high, the sugar rush of Kamala Harris being like a British candidate and having 100 days to the election, where Donald Trump is like this incredibly known and tested. And, to a lot of people, he's passed those tests. To a lot of people, he's failed those tests. But the guy has been tested over and over again over the last, almost decade now. And Kamala Harris is sort of just trying to keep that sugar high, be risk averse, be conventional, and be, someone that you can project your catharsis of not having to vote for Joe Biden or Donald Trump onto. So I think things will change after Labor Day because that's when the debate is going to happen. That's when Kamala Harris is going to be forced to take more questions from the media, though I don't expect to see a ton of that from her campaign. And that can really start to chip away, obviously, at this myth that's been built, this legend that's been built around Kamala Harris in recent days. At the same time, I don't think Republicans have successfully tested messaging against Kamala Harris yet. I don't think they've landed on anything that really is working quite yet either. So it's going to depend on that too. Okay, so give me a percentage before I let you go. Where are you right now in terms of percentage chances of a Harris victory? I would say 60-40, and I think it's going to be really close either way. I thought Joe Biden, and I maintain this, I think he would have beat Donald Trump. Oh, sorry, my earpiece just fell out. I'll repeat that. I think Joe Biden, even as bad a candidate he was, had a very good chance of beating Donald Trump. As crazy as that sounds, I maintain that. So I think Kamala Harris is obviously a much stronger candidate. Donald Trump has a really, really serious ceiling that he's having a hard time nudging upwards. So people don't like him. Some people really love him, but obviously that's not the whole country. Emily, as always, thank you so much. We'll see you back in the studio in DC. Sounds good. Thank you, Freddie. That was Emily Jashinsky, UnHerd's very own DC correspondent. Wow, 60-40, she says, is the odds she would put on the victory of Kamala Harris over Donald Trump. Hadn't expected her to be that strong, but it shows, to me at least, that whatever your political persuasion, it's hard to deny that at the end of this turbulent summer, having swapped out their candidate, the Democrats are at the very least level pegging and may actually be properly ahead of the November election. Absolutely fascinating stuff. Of course, Emily Jashinsky is host of her very own Undercurrents show. It is UnHerd's twice-weekly news show that we do out of our Washington, D.C. bureau. Make sure to check that out. It's got its very own YouTube channel. You can go and find it. We'll put the link in the text below. Or if you're listening on the podcast, it has its own podcast channel as well. Just search Undercurrents however you get your podcasts. Thanks for tuning in. And thanks to Emily. This was UnHerd.